Ambassador Bremer, Your Excellency Cynthia Schneider, honored guests, good evening. I'm happy to welcome you all here tonight. My name is Monique Knapen, and as director of the John Adams Institute, I'm proud to open this lecture event. For those who do not know the John Adams Institute, I will very briefly explain what we do. The John Adams Institute organizes lectures and discussions with American authors and other prominent Americans who have made history in their specialized fields of interest. Our lecture program has featured internationally renowned names such as Saul Bellow, Susan Sontag, John Irving, and Annie Proulx, as well as economist John Kenneth Galbraith, former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg. Robert Kaplan was in our program last March, and we just had novelist Julia Alvarez in our program last week. The John Adams Institute is a non-profit cultural foundation and is not committed to or dependent on any party. We do, however, want to show our gratitude and respect to our friends, members, and sponsors. Thanks to their help, we can continue to bring the best of the United States to Amsterdam. Tonight's lecture was made possible by one of our friends, Akzo Nobel. Thank you so much for helping us organize this event. Ambassador Bremer, we are very honored that you are our guest speaker tonight. Mr. Bremer, who has been former ambassador, ambassador to the Netherlands, former managing director of Kissinger Associates, and who is at present senior advisor at Marsh McLennan Companies Enterprise Risk. Last year, you headed the National Committee on Terrorism and advised American Congress and government on safety issues. This last aspect of your impressive career has brought us to tonight's topic. Thank you giving us this opportunity to hear your visions about the changing threat of international terrorism. We are proud that our former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Hans van den Broek, will introduce our guest speaker tonight. After Ambassador Bremer's talk of about 30 minutes, you will be treated to a discussion between Ms. Marianne van Leeuwen of Institute Klingendahl and Mr. Hans van den Broek and Ambassador Bremer. At some point, you will get the chance to join in. The present Ambassador of the United States to the Netherlands, Ms. Cynthia Schneider, will close the evening. Thank you so much for doing that. We expect to end this night at approximately 9:30, and there will be no intermission. Mr. Hans van den Broek, may I invite you to take the floor?
Madam Ambassador Cynthia Schneider, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by commending the John Adams Institute in the person of Monique Knapen, that they succeeded again, then this night, to capture, because I would call it capturing, an eminent speaker to make an introduction to us, followed by a discussion. I was asked to introduce Ambassador Bremer, and I was allowed 6 minutes to do that, which indicates, in fact, that this eminent personality hardly needs any introduction. Moreover, I will of course come back to a number of details, but moreover, it is hard to understand how such, I would say, a depressing subject fits with such a cheerful person as Ambassador Paul Bremer III. But nevertheless, it is very much worthwhile that somebody of his quality as such, of his wit and intelligence, deals with this problem. And maybe those Dutch people that are amongst the audience tonight share my impression that we, as Dutch, can reasonably count our blessings as far as the scourge of terrorism against Dutch citizens is concerned. Yes, in the past, but then I talk about times that are now a decade or more behind us, we have seen acts of terrorism as such, but fortunately not comparable with the very dramatic events that have hit, for instance, countries like the United States and its citizens, both abroad and at home. I think everybody remembers these dreadful events of the assaults on the World Trade Center in New York, or on the federal offices of in Oklahoma in the middle of the 90s, and the attacks on the embassies of the United States in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi in 1998. But also other, I would say, countries and regions in or close to Europe are under the threat and have been under the threat, and obviously also will continue to face certain threats of terrorism also in the future. We always follow the news, of course, about terrorist attacks by the ETA in Spain or by the IRA in Ireland. We know that also the Balkans, in fact, faces this tremendous problem, and we also see terrorism in the Middle East, and these are only a number of examples. And what is interesting to know and to hear about really from an expert is whether here the parameters of terrorism, by which I mean the motives on the one hand of the terrorists, the instruments as such, are they the same? Are they changing? How should we look at them in order to be able to analyze that and try to find answers how to prevent and how to combat the scourge of terrorism as such. And it is quite clear that with Ambassador Bremer, we have one of those eminent experts who could enlighten us on that subject, although I hope that Dr. Marianne van Leeuwen from Institute Klingendahl, who has specialized and focused very much in the past year and a half on these issues, will give us an interesting debate tonight with Ambassador Bremer. Why eminently placed Ambassador Bremer? Well, for the simple reason that this man with a very distinguished 23-year career in the diplomatic service was appointed in 1986 until the period 1989 by President Reagan as the man who was asked to try to formulate, in fact, global policies for the United States against terrorism as such. And the way in which he performed this obviously is also an explanation for the fact that only in 1999 the Speaker of the House in Washington asked Ambassador Bremer to become the chairman of the National Commission, which was reviewing, in fact, the policies against terrorism. This was referred to also by Monique Knapen in her introduction. And then we see that this former senior diplomat, in fact, in the year 2000, becomes the managing director of Enterprise Risk, a consulting, if I express myself well, a consulting body attached to Marsh McLennan companies as such, which gives professional advice, notably to the business community, on exposures that they have to fear from possible terrorism as such. Now, why is it for me such a personal pleasure and a privilege to introduce Ambassador Bremer? Because obviously our acquaintance with him does not go back to this very difficult field of counter-terrorism, but much more to his very distinguished service in fostering the relations between the United States in the Netherlands in a very difficult period between 1983 and 1986. And many of you will realize that those were the days that there was almost political crisis in the Netherlands on security issues, and notably on the yes or no about deployment of the INF, the nuclear intermediate missiles, here on Dutch soil. And Ambassador Bremer, as a matter of fact, was the one who had the very delicate task of, on the one hand, explaining to Washington what those typical Dutch meant by explaining to everybody the dilemmas that they felt about the yes or no of deployment, and on the other hand had the delicate task of convincing, in a not too much overpowering way, the Dutch government, the Dutch parliament, Dutch citizens, that unity within NATO on this issue was absolutely indispensable in order to guarantee an effective and credible arms control policy. I will not say that eventually, dear Jerry, Gorbachev solved the whole problem for us all, but nevertheless, he was a great help. Finally, as far as my introduction goes, I would like to mention that we have the most happy and respectful recollections of that period in Jerry Bremer's life as ambassador to the Netherlands, in which we became friends as such, where we enjoyed meeting him professionally and meeting him and his charming wife Nancy socially as such. He was somebody who was used, when he was assigned to a foreign country, to speak the language. I haven't tested him yet tonight about his Dutch. His introduction, I think, will be in English, but I think if a Dutch question is put to him, you make a fair chance of a reasonable answer anyhow. And finally, Jerry, a personal word. You know, I don't think I ever said that to you, but you're one of the very few, no, you're probably the only Republican that reminds me of the Democrat John F. Kennedy as such. Well, so let's listen, I would say, to what Ambassador Bremer is going to tell us about this very difficult problem in which he is so much specialized, and I hope that at a later point we can embark upon an interesting, if possible even provoking discussion. Jerry, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Hans, for that very gracious introduction. And before I even thank our hosts tonight, I want to say, in respect of Minister van den Broek's comments about the cruise missile situation, which was quite a hot subject when we were here last. Really, the congratulations for the decision on cruise missiles belongs to Hans van den Broek and to the other members of the government at that time, and particularly to the members from his party in the Tweede Kamer, all of whom had to make, in my view, one of the most courageous political decisions that I saw in my 23 years in politics. It was not an easy decision, and Hans himself, I think, should get a great deal of the responsibility and really gratitude of everybody in this country for having put that decision across. I think it, and Hans has heard me say this before, I think when the history of the Soviet Union is written later by historians, they will find that the decision of the Dutch government to deploy cruise missiles was at least an important element in the eventual decision of Gorbachev to change directions. There were other factors involved, but he understood after the Dutch took the decision that he was not going to break the back of NATO. He was not going to destroy the European security system that we had put in place since 1948. And I think the Dutch decision, therefore, needs to be seen in a broader context. And I think, Hans, you and your colleagues deserve a great deal of credit, and will get it in history. It is a great pleasure to be back to the John Adams Stichting, a stichting that when we were here in the Netherlands, I felt very strongly about and tried to support, of course, because of John Adams's particular importance to this country and to our relations as the first American ambassador. And I have to draw attention, not only is Ambassador Schneider here tonight, but my good friend Terry Dornbush is also here somewhere. I don't know, I can't see where he is, but I know he's here. There he is. So we have two former American ambassadors and a sitting American ambassador here. Reminds me of a terrorist situation that developed in the Philippines not long ago, where you've probably been reading about this terrorist group in Mindanao in southern Philippines, which grabs tourists, and they grabbed a group of tourists. There was a British, a French, and an American tourist. They were grabbed this took place about 6 weeks ago. And the Philippine government refused to pay the ransom, so the terrorists announced that they were going to execute these guys the next morning. But they could each have a last wish. the night before. So they asked the Frenchman what he'd like, and he said, well, I would really like a good 5-course meal with good wine and everything. And they said, well, it's a little hard to organize here in the jungle, but we'll get you whatever you want. And he said, well, that's great. And they turned to Britt and they said, what is your last wish? And he said, well, I would like a chance one last time to ride my wild horse across the heath and really remember what it's like in the moors and the uplands. And they said, well, we don't have too many moors here in the jungle, but we'll get you a horse and you can have your last ride tonight before you're executed in the morning. And they came to the American and they said, well, what's your last wish? And he said, well, I've been thinking about it. I'd like to hear a speech by the American ambassador. At which point the British and the French both jumped up and said, in that case, execute us immediately. The modern wave of terrorism, and I call it a modern wave because terrorism's been around a long time, began about 30 years ago with a group of very memorable attacks in the Middle East. I think a lot has changed in the world since then, but when you talk to today's terrorist analysts, they are still asking themselves the same 4 questions today that they asked 30 years ago. Who are the terrorists? What are their motives? How do they get their support? And how can we defeat them? If the questions have remained more or less the same, I think the answers have changed. And it's the changing threat of terrorism that I want to talk about tonight. But before I get to that, I want to make a few general points about terrorism as a public policy issue, because it is a unique public policy issue that poses unique problems, I think, to leaders. First of all, terrorism is obviously a highly emotional issue, especially after a terrorist incident, when you've got people dead or wounded, property's been destroyed, people's lives have been disrupted, places that were safe have become insecure. The problem for the policymaker is between the incidents, it's very hard to sustain a high level of attention to the problem. So political leaders are faced with a major dilemma: how to avoid the pitfalls of an overly emotional reaction in the wake of a terrorist incident while keeping enough attention to the problem that you can sustain basically the amount of money you need to fight the issue over a longer period of time. You need to find, in effect, a political approach which is both balanced and sustainable over time. And I should say in this respect, it's obvious that promoting hysteria in the wake of a terrorist incident is not a good public policy because it doesn't meet the test of being both balanced and sustainable. The second problem is that successes in counterterrorism are rarely known to the public, while failures are dramatic and visible and immediate. That's because successes very often depend in this business on good intelligence, and I'll talk some more about intelligence in a minute, and that kind of intelligence rarely can be made public. So you have basically a dichotomy between your successes that you can't talk about and your failures, which are obvious to everybody right away. Thirdly, successes in counterterrorism are made difficult by what I call 2 asymmetries that are particular to the fight against terrorism. First, the offense, which in this case is the terrorists, has a huge advantage. In the fight against terrorism, defenders have to defend all their weak points all around the world, whether they're embassies or military posts or businesses or whatever the threat is against. You have to defend across an entire spectrum, whereas the terrorists can attack at the weakest link. For example, the terrorists who attacked us in East Africa, where they correctly believed our security would not be as great as they would be, say, in the Middle East. This is in stark contrast to the general sort of conventional wisdom in military affairs, which holds that an offense needs at least a 3-to-1 advantage over a defense to be successful. Here it's the other way around. And the second asymmetry is that the costs of defense are geometrically greater than the costs of offense. Take, for example, defending an airport like Schiphol. It costs you literally millions of dollars to set up an effective defense for an airport like Schiphol. But if a terrorist can get in there, all he needs is an AK-47 and a couple of clips of ammunition or maybe even a pipe bomb to do very great damage. His costs are dramatically lower than the costs of defense. Fourth general point, democracies, and this will be no surprise to anybody in the Netherlands, democracies are very poor at planning ahead and are rarely proactive. In many ways, that's because they are democracies, and that's what we like about democracies. They don't try to plan everything. We don't want that kind of a world. But what happens often in democracies is when political leaders try to plan for events, they often tend to use words that actually complicate the search for effective solutions. And I'll use two examples. One example is the Middle East problem, as we call it in the United States. Well, when you use the word problem in English or in Dutch, the implication is that there's a solution. When we talk about terrorism, at least in the United States, we often talk about a war against terrorism. And if you talk about wars, you have to think about victories. Well, my point is, the Middle East is not a problem, it's a situation. There isn't a solution to the Middle East problem, in my view, because it's not a problem, it's a situation. What you can do is try to figure out how to manage the situation better. And there is no real war against terrorism because there's no final victory. What there is a struggle against terrorism. So you have to be very careful about the words you use. Fifth point, there's a risk, and it's particularly a risk, I think, in the United States. It has a lot to do with our cultural approach to foreign affairs. There's a risk of over-personalizing the fight or struggle against terrorists. In effect, to try to find a single terrorist who embodies the worst of terrorism, and then you can go and pick him out. In the late 70s, our number one enemy was Gaddafi. Then we shifted in the 80s to Abu Nidal. And of course, now we have Osama bin Laden. I'm not saying these were not terrorists. I'm just saying that there's a problem with over-personalizing the approach. One problem is that it gives the impression to the public that if you could get your hands on that number one terrorist, the problem would go away. It won't go away, because what bin Laden represents is something much broader than just bin Laden. And the other problem is, with this approach, is you tend to build up that number one terrorist in the eyes of his potential followers. So over-personalizing the struggle against terrorism, which I admit is a particularly American problem, is not usually wise public policy. And finally, on these general points about public policy, it's important to avoid what I call the Hamlet Syndrome. In effect, seeing only the arguments against actions to fight terrorism. Let me explain. At one time or another, some or all of the following arguments are always heard in the debate about what to do about terrorism. First, it's always said, well, diplomacy has its limits against terrorists. It's hard to figure out how you really use diplomacy effectively against terrorism. Secondly, and very fashionable in the United States now, is the assertion that sanctions, economic sanctions, do not work against states in general, and therefore is not an effective way to fight terrorist states. Thirdly, there are people who will say, yeah, but you really shouldn't use the military either, because if we strike them, they're just going to strike back and we get into a tit-for-tat escalatory. And you have, in some ways, the same argument about law enforcement, capturing terrorists and putting them on trial. People will say, well, but if you capture him and put him on trial, he basically becomes a martyr, or he becomes a target of other terrorist attacks where they want to free the terrorist. My point is, you can go down through these arguments. Each of them, in a way, has a certain logic to it, but you run the risk that when you add them all up, you say to yourself, there's nothing I can do in the fight against terrorism. And that it seems to me that's not an acceptable answer for policymakers. Now let me turn a bit to the question of the threat and how I believe it is changing. And to do that, let me talk first about what I would call the threat of old terrorism, the terrorism that we experienced really over the period from the late 60s, I would say, through the early 90s. I think it is generally agreed that terrorists at that time had limited motives, which determined the mechanics of their attacks and the structure of their organizations. Let me say a word about all three of those. On motives, a lot of the terrorist groups in the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, both the homegrown terrorist groups in Europe and the terrorist groups we saw particularly in the Middle East, had what I call sort of discrete political goals. They were seeking understanding and support for whatever their political goal was. And so what they wanted to do, in the words of a prominent American terrorist expert, counter-terrorist expert, they were trying to win a place at the table. They wanted to be able to discuss whatever the issue was. Sometimes they wanted, they wanted to get people out of jail. But basically, they thought that if they could use an attack as a way to get attention to their goal, their particular agenda, this would help get them broader support in the public. Well, that affected the mechanics of their attacks. It meant that they wanted to kill a few people so that the press would be there and they'd get attention. But they didn't want to kill so many people that they would turn off the public support which they were trying to get. They wanted, in the words of Brian Jenkins, an American counterterrorist expert, they wanted a lot of people watching but not a lot of people dead. And I think that accurately sums it up. This then has implications, the motives and mechanics for the structure. It meant that the structure of the groups needed to be very tightly controlled. You know, terrorists are often, in my view, often inaccurately described as being sort of crazy or irrational. Actually, the leaders of terrorist groups are quite cold-bloodedly rational. And these kinds of groups basically wanted tight control on their structure, first, because they didn't want to get captured or killed, and secondly, because they didn't want the attacks to get out of their control, precisely because they wanted not indiscriminate deaths or casualties, but just enough to get attention. And so you had a situation where the motives, mechanics, and structure fit a clear pattern which we saw during the 70s and 80s. State sponsorship of terrorism in those years was very important, and I'll come back to state sponsorship in a minute. Now, I would argue that by the early 1980s, a Western strategy began to come into place to fight terrorism. The West had some very important successes against this old-style terrorism in the 1980s. First, the European governments got serious about fighting their homegrown terrorism. Baader-Meinhof, Red Brigade's Action Directe, the CCC in Belgium. And they did this by recognizing, I think importantly, that the good guys, they, should not be any less organized than the bad guys. And so a very intensive period of cooperation was begun in the European community, as it then was, through the Trevi Group, which was a group of interior and justice ministers cooperating against terrorism. And I would add, with the constant, and some, perhaps even Hans van den Broek would say, annoying encouragement of the American government, our friends in Europe came to support the position that state terrorism was not a legitimate way to act in international affairs. After our military response to Libyan terrorism in April of 1986, the Europeans joined us later that year in putting pressure on Syria, and the reward for that was that Syria expelled Abu Nidal from Damascus in July of 1987, effectively marking the end of his terrorist career. Most European states also came to agree that the Iranian revolutionary government's active support of terrorism was unacceptable. But I would say that these successes, thank you, it's actually this thing, these are what are, not used to Dutch flowers anymore. The successes we had in the early 80s and 80s don't guarantee that we'll have success against the new threat of terrorism. Now, the U.S. National Commission on Terrorism, which I was honored to chair, reached the important conclusion that terrorists' motives, mechanics, and structures have changed in the course of the last decade. This, incidentally, is a conclusion that is shared by all the major European intelligence agencies and by, I would say, a vast majority of the respected international terrorist analysts with which I'm familiar. What are those changes? The first and most important change is a shift. I'm not saying the old terrorism went away, but what we're seeing is a shift in many terrorist groups towards more, more ideological, religious, ethnic, or apocalyptic terrorists. These are groups which are motivated less by a narrow political concern and more by hatred, or they seek revenge. This has implications for the mechanics. These kinds of groups are much less concerned to restrain the number of casualties. Indeed, in some cases, it may be their objective to kill as many people as possible. And we see, therefore, a shift from, among some of these groups, from discriminate to indiscriminate casualties. Jim Woolsey, former director of Central Intelligence, who served on our commission, says they're no longer seeking a place at the table. What they want to do is turn the table over and kill everybody at it. It's quite a different approach. Now, this has also led to changes in the structure. of the fight against of the terrorists. We still have states involved, but they are less involved, I think, fortunately, because of Western policy. But many of these terrorist groups are being less concerned to calibrate carefully the level of violence, are willing to have much more loose organizational structures. Let everybody go out and kill whoever they want to kill. Just go out and do it. Much looser organizations, less hierarchical, less tightly controlled. The good news out of that is that these groups are often not very professional, and good police and intelligence work can thwart the attacks or at least catch the perpetrators afterwards. The bad news is these kinds of groups are much more difficult for intelligence agencies to penetrate precisely because they're not as well organized. I think the facts of the last decade bear out this analysis of the shift in motives, mechanics, and structure. During the 1990s, if you look at the figures which the United States government keeps on international terrorism, the number of individual terrorist attacks during the 90s each year has gone down, pretty much every year. But the number of casualties is rising, so that today a given terrorist attack is 20% more likely to result in deaths than was the case 20 years ago. In America, we saw several attacks that were intended to kill not hundreds but thousands of people. The attack on the World Trade Center, which in the end, fortunately, killed only 6 people, the intention had been to topple one of the towers against the other, which would have caused tens of thousands of casualties. The same group of people had been planning attacks on the major tunnels into New York and on the UN building, which again were intended to kill thousands of people. We had the fortunately thwarted attacks in Jordan at the Millennium and the thwarted attacks in the United States at the Millennium, again, where the intention was to kill lots of people. Moreover, there's been a steady increase in the number of terrorist attacks in the last decade which are not claimed by any group, which again indicates to me that the terrorist attacks do not have the intention of setting up a negotiation or drawing attention to their goal. It suggests that in many cases the intention is in fact revenge or hatred. And recently it's become clear that increasing numbers of terrorists are not afraid to die in the course of carrying out their attacks. The attacks that Hans van den Broek mentioned on our embassies in East Africa are a good example. The attack on the frigate Cole in Aden, good example of a suicide attack. There were suicide bombings in Israel, most recently just this weekend. And the threat just yesterday by Sheikh Nasrullah, the leader of Hezbollah in Tehran, that terrorists should use all available means to, as he put it, obliterate the Zionist cancer. This is not the talk of moderate people. Our commission concluded, and this has been a conclusion agreed upon by 3 subsequent national commissions in the United States, that there is a significant threat that terrorists, because of these new motives and mechanics, might escalate their attacks by resorting to the use of chemical, nuclear, biological, or radiological agents, CBRN, as it is put. This is new and obviously troubling. And so I want to say a word about why I think this changing threat needs to concern us all. In the 70s and 80s, counter-terrorist experts that I was in touch with then, we all concluded that there was little likelihood of terrorists turning to chemical, biological, or nuclear terrorism because really we had 4 points. First of all, most terrorist groups operating in those years, as I have said, wanted to accomplish their goals, which they could do with conventional weapons, bombs and machine guns, just to draw attention to their cause. They didn't need to escalate. Secondly, escalating to higher levels of violence would risk alienating the public. Third, these kinds of materials, chemical, biological, nuclear materials, were not easy to acquire and were dangerous to handle. And fourth, most fundamentally, we were convinced that there was a real asymmetry in threatening to use these kinds of weapons or using them. What actually would you ask for in return for not using a nuclear weapon on, say, Amsterdam? What is the negotiation you're trying to set up? And so it was the view of most counter-terrorist experts that in the 70s and 80s anyway, that was unlikely that people would move up. Well, what has changed in the 90s is, as I've said, a change in motives. And we saw the first major terrorist attack using chemical weapons in 1995 when the apocalyptic group Aum Shinrikyo attacked the Tokyo subway system. That attack, and I would argue the lessons of the Gulf War, give rise to the new threat environment. Because the Gulf War showed that even a lavishly equipped army, and we need to remember that in 1990, Saddam Hussein's army was the 5th largest army in the world. It was a very heavily equipped army. Even the largest army in the world was no match for a modern technical military force such as America fielded in 1990. So terrorist states like Iraq now clearly understand the advantages of having force-multiplying weapons like chemical, biological, and nuclear weaponry to offset their conventional inferiority. It's perhaps not surprising, but nonetheless unsettling to know that 5 of the 7 states which the United States designates as state sponsors of terrorism, 5 of the 7 have military programs to develop precisely those weapons, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And each of the 5 has a program to develop ballistic missile programs to deliver those weapons. I would argue that Iraq poses the biggest immediate danger. It is now known that before the Gulf War, Saddam had programs in nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Iraq had over 100,000 people involved in its nuclear program alone, a program that had cost it, we estimate, over $20 billion. That's why the UN Security Resolution that effectively ended the war explicitly required Iraq to accept supervised destruction of all of these materials. Iraq, I hardly need to emphasize, has failed to comply with the resolution. According to a recent United Nations report, Iraq still has almost 4 tons of VX gas, 4,000 tons of ingredients to make chemical weapons, at least 25 ballistic missile warheads with germ agents loaded up, anthrax and botulinum toxin, 3,000 tons of other poisonous gas agents, 107,000 casings for chemical weapons, and so forth. And this is certainly only the tip of the iceberg, since due to what I would call, I'm afraid not very politely, the feckless incompetence of the international community, there have been no inspections in Iraq for almost 2.5 years now. The German intelligence service recently concluded that Iraq could have nuclear bombs within 3 years, and by the year 2005, ballistic missiles with a range of 3,000 kilometers, which, needless to say, reaches all of Western Europe. The UK Defense Ministry 10 days ago announced that Saddam has reopened a plant at Al-Dawra, outside of Baghdad, a plant which before the war was used to develop biological weapons. He's now reopened it under the guise of doing research for foot and mouth disease. So there's a problem with these terrorist sponsoring states developing these kinds of weapons, and the most immediate problem is Iraq. But CBRN agents have a great appeal for terrorist groups too, not just for states. Many such groups, I argue, as I've said, are no longer concerned about how many casualties they can inflict. In fact, they may want to inflict more casualties. Most experts who've looked at this, and that would include our commission, consider that while it may be a lower probability that terrorists will move to CBRN, the consequences are so great that policymakers have to take it into consideration. And most experts think that the most likely threat comes from biological agents. This was certainly the conclusion of my commission. And the reason is that biological agents, some of the reasons are, biological agents often take days or weeks to make themselves known, which allows perpetrators time to escape before it's noticed. Secondly, biological agents produce a disproportionate psychological fear in the public at large because you don't know how anthrax or smallpox or whatever it is moving around. And of course, biological agents could be used, as they have been in the past, in attacks against agriculture to cause economic and social damage. I would simply say the recent concerns that have been present in Europe about BSE and hoof-and-mouth disease give a glimpse about how devastating to public morale and to political leaders such an attack could be. The lethality of biological weapons is really quite stunning when you compare it to conventional weapons. For example, a terrorist group has a choice if it wants to kill a certain number of people per square kilometer, has the following choice, and it just gives you an example of the lethality. They could use 32 million grams of cluster bomb materials, conventional weapons, 3.2 million grams of mustard gas, or 800,000 grams of nerve gas, or 5,000 grams of crude nuclear fission weaponry, or 80 grams of botulinum toxin, or 8 grams of anthrax. So 8 grams of anthrax will kill the same number of people per square kilometer as 32 million grams of cluster bomb materials. Western intelligence agencies know that some terrorist groups have already tried to acquire agents of mass destruction. For example, 3 years ago, Osama bin Laden publicly told reporters from Time magazine that it was the religious duty of all good Muslims to kill Americans wherever they could and to acquire any weapons possible for such attacks. Lest he be misunderstood, bin Laden repeated the threat 2 days later on American television. One of his top assistants was subsequently arrested in Germany trying to buy highly enriched uranium. And in testimony just 3 weeks ago in a trial in the west coast of the United States, it was revealed that bin Laden is continuing efforts to acquire uranium in Sudan. Now, fortunately, it's not that easy to acquire the stuff or to make it, and it's even more difficult to weaponize it. It is difficult to turn these things into effective weapons, and one of the recommendations our commission made was that it's important to look at the kind of specialized equipment which is needed to weaponize biological agents and try to have tighter control over those pieces of equipment. I'm talking about things like very specialized fermenting equipment, aerosol technology, and various kinds of filtration equipment which could be more tightly controlled, certainly in the United States and probably in Europe. So it's not all one-sided, and as I said at the outset, it's not as if I think it is a high probability that terrorists will move up the escalatory ladder, but it is at least a possibility, and that has implications for public policy. What are the implications for policy of the changing threat? Obviously, first and foremost, the world community, led by the West, has got to continue the fight against both the old terrorism, which will continue to be what makes most of the headlines, hopefully, and the new terrorism, which I hope we don't see any of. While it is unfashionable to admit it here in Europe, it is a fact that states continue to support terrorism, particularly Iran, which is the world's primary supporter of terrorism. And anybody who has any doubts can simply read the transcripts from the conference in Tehran yesterday, including statements by the alleged moderate Khatami, the president. Iraq, whose capabilities on mass casualty weaponry I've already outlined. European perspectives on both of these countries differ from America's, I'm under no illusion, and this will be a difficult challenge for political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. In the case of terrorist groups, in many ways the challenges are even more difficult because of their new motives and their willingness to inflict higher levels of casualties. It sort of calls into account all of the deterrent strategies which we developed for the old terrorism. For example, when you're dealing with a terrorist group, take bin Laden's group, classic diplomacy doesn't do you very much good. You don't have an ambassador you can recall, from whatever valley he's hiding out in Afghanistan. You can't make that point. There's no way to embargo a group's exports or imports, and no diplomatic démarche, no matter how carefully developed by clever diplomats, is going to make very much of an impression on a man like bin Laden. And at the bottom, as I said earlier, there's really no bargain to be made. Bin Laden hates America for what it is. We can't change ourselves. We cannot do what he wants us to do, which is to become something else. So I think there is no deal to be made with groups like that, and those are hard lessons. But there are lessons of the successes of the 1980s. The first requirement for an effective counter-terrorist strategy is good information about the terrorists, because the objective of a counter-terrorist strategy has to be to prevent attacks he wants us to do, which is to become something else. So I think there is no deal to be made with groups like that, and those are hard lessons. But there are lessons of the successes of the 1980s. The first requirement for an effective counter-terrorist strategy is good information about the terrorists, because the objective of a counter-terrorist strategy has to be to prevent attacks. It's fine to talk about going out afterwards and capturing people, but what you really want to do is save lives by preventing attacks. If you're going to prevent an attack, you have to know what the plan is beforehand in order to prevent it. To know the plan beforehand, you have to have somebody who knows the plan, which means you need a spy in the terrorist group. That's the best intelligence you can get on terrorism. And that's, in my 35 years in dealing in foreign policy, one way or the other, I've never seen a policy area which was more dependent on good intelligence than counterterrorism, and where the intelligence was more difficult to get than in the fight against terrorism. But several of the key recommendations of the Bremer Commission, therefore, dealt with improving our capability to collect good intelligence against terrorists. Our commission concluded that the United States has put into effect a bunch of rules governing the recruitment of terrorist informants, rules which affect the CIA's operations overseas, that are too restrictive and which in fact have the effect of discouraging the recruitment of terrorist spies. And we recommended that those guidelines be rescinded and a policy procedure that was in place before 1995 be reinstated. The rules that the CIA put in are cumbersome, they're slow, and they are very bureaucratic. We also suggested clarifying the rules governing the FBI's counter-terrorist intelligence gathering against international terrorists in the United States. The law which established our commission also asked us to examine the question of how good our cooperation was with friendly countries in the fight against terrorism. We concluded that on the whole, the cooperation is very good among intelligence and law enforcement agencies, though there's always some scope for more cooperation on the intelligence area, almost certainly on bilateral basis, not on a multilateral basis because of the sensitivity of the information. On the other hand, it is also clear that foreign offices, foreign ministries on each side of the Atlantic tend to have differing views, particularly on how to deal with state sponsors, like the most acute differences involved today, Iraq, Iran, and to a lesser extent, Libya, all of which the American government continues to consider to be state sponsors. Most, but not all, of the rationale in America for establishing a missile defense, which is something that is broadly agreed by both of our major political parties, derives from the analysis that we have vulnerabilities in this area. So, as was the case back in the early 80s, the fight against terrorism is again going to be a challenge to the transatlantic relationship. And again, it involves broader issues on how best to deal with the evolving threats to our publics. The most urgent issue before us, I believe, is Iraq, for the reasons I laid out before. I think, as was the case in the 1980s, when the last time a coherent strategy was put together, clear thinking and straight talk and patience are probably the way to go. I'm confident that political leaders, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, will be able to fashion a broad and effective counter-terrorist strategy to meet the threat of the new terrorism that I described. But the starting point to arrive at an agreed and effective strategy is the recognition that, in fact, we do face a changing threat. Thank you very much.
Ja, jij ook eerst.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're doing a wonderful job.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, I think Mr. Van den Broek just provoked me to start to give some reactions on the speech by Ambassador Bremer. I'd like to make a couple of preliminary remarks, if I may. More to my mouth. I'm going to be critical a bit. First of all, because I do disagree with some aspects of dominant US thinking, and I won't be intimidated even if many renowned scholars seem to be thinking your way. I'll still try to make some points here, but also, of course, because the purpose of this evening is debate and to stimulate thought, and I very much hope that you in the audience will join the debate.
And the third reason is because you're Dutch.
Right, we are argumentative. That's true. Now, I would like to make two preliminary remarks to immediately take off the edge of my remarks beforehand. First of all, I do realize, and everybody should, that the United States and US citizens are much more exposed to terrorist threats than many European countries, certainly than the Netherlands. We are in a very comfortable position for having so little problems with terrorism. We haven't had any catastrophic attacks here. We have not had any radical Islamic threats here, terrorist threats, that is. We're in a comfortable position, and that calls for a certain modesty on our part, but not for a thoughtless embrace of US views. I realize,
Echte Nederlands.
I realize, moreover, that both, as you said, quite rightly, that both here and in the United States, it's true that counter-terrorist intelligence is a secretive or a discreet profession par excellence. And this means that we don't hear of the many successes of counterintelligence openly. Only what we see immediately is spectacular failures. But when we see spectacular failures, we should always realize that this is not probably, these are the exceptions probably. It's not frequent or even regular that intelligence services make such failures. They do essential work and dangerous work, and I'm sure that most of them are intelligent and very effective. Now, here are for my criticisms. As you said, the US perception is that there's changing threat in international terrorism, catastrophic terrorism that is aimed at making as many casualties as possible and at random, is growing, and it will become perhaps the dominant trend. In connection with this catastrophic terrorism, there is the fear that terrorists will soon be using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. Then there's your argument about the organizational changes, a change from tightly organized hierarchical organizations to all-channel networks, which comes in combination probably with the use that terrorists make very aptly of computer systems and mobile telephones and such. It's simply more easy to organize yourself in such all-channel networks than it used to be. Terrorists no longer are professionals. They are more or less, it's no longer a full-time profession, it's a hire and fire job. People kill and they disappear again, and that makes it more difficult to catch terrorists before the act or perhaps even after. So terrorists have become more elusive than they used to be. That's a major element. And all these factors, of course, call for adaptations in anti-terrorist policies. More attention should be given to disaster control and to the technicalities of intelligence gathering. As you said, intelligence officers should be more aggressive in their approach to terrorism, take the initiative, and use all the leeway the law is allowing them. It should be stepped up by making available the most advanced technical equipment. I don't essentially disagree, but I don't know whether it will work entirely as you would hope. Now, here's my comments. As far as change is concerned, I think that I do agree that terrorists seem to have fewer qualms killing than they used to. But I still think that when you look at the statistics, most terrorists, if they kill, they don't kill on a large scale. Massive terrorism is the exception so far. And I don't think that you could really argue that there is a rise in such attacks, because you can go back to the early 80s in Lebanon, and you had such attacks already. And I would pose to you, for the same reasons, that they are being perpetrated right now. I refer to the attacks on American Marines and French Marines in Beirut in the early 80s. Now, in honor of our American speaker, I would start with technology. I think there is much confusion about the ease with which terrorists may get hold of and use unconventional weapons. And this allows experts, or experts in inverted commas, to choose the interpretation that fits their overall theory best. I shamelessly follow the same device here. I follow, for instance, the reports by a very good American organization, the Henry Stimson organization, who published a report the other day called Ataxia, where they claim that it is not impossible for terrorists, for non-state groups to get hold of unconventional weapons. It's perhaps even possible to produce them, especially in the chemical or biological field. But it is not really easy to weaponize them. Right. And it is certainly not easy to weaponize them in such a way that you can kill with them massively. Catastrophic attacks so far, with the terrible and frightening exception of the attack in Tokyo, have been perpetrated with conventional means. I also think that, where I go along, of course, entirely with that, the proliferation ambitions of countries like Iraq and Iran are frightening and should and call for strong countermeasures. I do not automatically see the linkage between the support of these countries for terrorist groups on the one hand and their proliferation ambitions on the other hand. I don't think you can easily add them up. I can see Saddam Hussein, for instance, supporting terrorist groups, but I find it harder to imagine him handing these troops chemical or biological weapons. These people are very distrustful of everybody around them, and I think it would be foolhardy of them, and they probably would consider it reckless themselves, to give these weapons to others that they do not control entirely. It would be dangerous for themselves. In any case, I'm not aware, but then I'm looking at it from the outside, that so far that rogue states or states of concern have, until now, actually presented these weapons to terrorists. Support, yes, but unconventional weapons, that's another story, I think. Secondly, and it's maybe equally important, I think that US analysts and European analysts maybe as well, believe too easily that terrorists want to kill at random on a massive scale, just for the kick of it almost. Now, there may be some terrorists who are truly psychopaths, but as you said, they would be the exception to the rule. There is logic to even the most radical terrorist thinking. I'd like to say that, or put forward that, whereas I agree that good intelligence is really the best way to fight terrorism, part of that good intelligence should be the interpretation of motive. And when I look at American reports on these issues, and I wonder when I'm going to get some information on these motivations, for instance, of Osama bin Laden, other than hatred or revenge, which are elements, but they do have a religious motive behind it, and they make it explicit. And I think sometimes that perhaps to improve intelligence, it would be a good idea to have, not just to collect more and more data, but to also ensure that you have good interpreters, that you have people who know languages. We had, just this week, we had this very unfortunate incident in Peru where an airplane was shut down, and it turned out one of the problems had been that there was no good communication between the CIA people involved and the Peruvian pilots, because the CIA people didn't speak Spanish. And they were saying, we haven't been trained in that for years now. I think it's in your report as well, isn't it? I mean, that's maybe it's a little bit a European remark, but it's not just the quantity of the information, it should be the quality as well. So you need linguists. I think you need experts on religions, on extremist strains in religions, not just Islam, but also Judaism or Christianity or whatever have you. And that would help you get into the skin of terrorists and maybe find them more easily and more quickly than you would if you just collected more and more data and wondered what they meant afterwards. Gee, I have a lot of points. I should go through them quickly. There's another side with that, just briefly. When you look at Osama bin Laden, he doesn't have any qualms in killing on a massive scale. I think the explanation for him, for other so-called Afghans, or people who have their inspiration from the Islamic war against the communist invasion of Afghanistan, I think their motivation really is that they feel that they are at war with the United States and that they are at war with Israel. I don't say that you should condone it or agree with it, but I think it explains their violence and the ease with which they kill massively. So they feel that they are at war, and in war you kill your enemy, especially if you are very much aware that your enemy is technically and materially vastly superior to you. This is the means you have. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to claim it every time, because it should be obvious. It's your enemy attacking you see. So one more small point in connection with radical Islam. Although you have these religious motives, I would say that even today, nationalism comes into it as well. And that may be a break for these radical Islamic terrorists to use unconventional weapons. For instance, I don't see adherents of Hamas using unconventional weapons in the occupied territories or in Israel, because these weapons are indiscriminate and their own people will be killed by them. That will be a break. So if they use them, they will use them at the other end of the world rather than closely at home. That doesn't make it less frightening, but no. I think it's a point. One more short point to organization. I think here are two elements that that you can combine only with difficulty. On the one hand, you notice the development to an all-channel networks, less hierarchy. On the other hand, you see the fear of terrorists using unconventional weapons. It would seem to me, especially if terrorists have the ambition to produce such weapons, they will need a hierarchy, a strictly organized hierarchy. And the major example is the organization that was behind the only catastrophic attack with an unconventional weapon. That was the Ohm sect, which was a large sect with a strictly hierarchical structure. So that somehow it seems to be conflict a bit with the general picture here. I'll make it shorter. Yeah. Right. I will give them the floor now. I'll stop. Go ahead.
Well, it's not my turn actually, because I'm not an expert on this. I'm listening very carefully. But let me make one remark at this very stage, also in the direction of Ambassador Bremer, thanking him very much for his very clear speech. One thing is absolutely certain, whether we agree or maybe differ of opinion as to whether there is really a change in the threat as such, which was, I think, one of the main points that the ambassador made as such. What remains, of course, very important indeed, is that transatlantically there remains a sound, I would say, communication with a combined effort to fight terrorism. If we disagree, and certainly if we disagree in public, about the seriousness of the threat, about the motives of terrorists, about the instruments they might use and how dangerous that may be, whom are we serving with that kind of debate? I think the terrorists can learn a lot from that. They can divide and rule as well. Now, my question is, having listened to Ambassador Bremer's speech, where does the United States, or for that matter, Ambassador Bremer himself, feel that the cooperation could be, the transatlantic cooperation in this field could be improved? One element there struck me, and that is the recommendation of the National Commission, which was chaired by Ambassador Bremer, and which, if I say it very briefly and maybe not quite accurately, advocated to loosen somewhat the existing legal limitations on the gathering of information. Look, I can imagine it's not always fun being the single world power as such, and I can imagine that where the threat of terrorism is much more actual and lively amongst the people of the United States, that one would be prepared to go further on the limitation of fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals, for instance in the field of collecting information, following people and what have you, than in countries where that threat is less clear, is less acute as such. But where does Ambassador Bremer have the feeling that on our side of the Atlantic we could improve and we could assist in order to counter the terrorist threat. One more point, and that's the political one, which he mentioned a few times, and which I think we all are here very much aware of, is that there are, well, let's put it diplomatically and mildly, nuances in the approach towards how to handle Iraq between the United States and the Europeans. But Jerry, let's be clear, as far as my understanding as a retired minister goes, there is still a vast majority in the European Union that fully supports, as such, the existing UN embargoes against Iraq. And I dare admit that it is regrettable that there may be one member state, and certainly one also being a member of the Security Council, that has a different opinion there, but so
I can't imagine who you have in mind, Hans.
Sorry, but so
I have to
far,
think very hard what country that might be.
I leave that to your imagination, which I know is sufficient.
Yeah,
to,
it's vivid, yes.
Yes, and you speak the language as well, so that's no problem either. But that there we at least can say that transatlantically the approach in fact results in the same position, and that is maintain the embargo and do not be detracted by the stories about the children that are suffering in Iraq, but not as a cause of the embargo, but as a cause that Saddam Hussein prefers to use his abundant funds for other purposes than feeding his own people. Maybe that as an introduction.
Shall I react?
I'd like to add a question.
Okay.
About the continuance of American foreign policy. You wrote that you presided over your committee under President Clinton.
Be a little clear
What is your view on the policies of the new administration in this connection?
Okay, let me run down a few points that you raised first, Marianne, if I can. I want to be clear about this question of the threat of chemical and particularly biological. It is correct to say that so far we really haven't seen any of this except the Aum Shinrikyo attack. I get very nervous with what in the profession is called straight line reasoning, where one says, you know, here's the trend line and it's going to extend. Economists are great at that, you know. I'm not so sure that it's satisfactory to say that because we haven't seen large-scale non-conventional attacks, we won't. We certainly have seen large-scale conventional attacks, as you point out, as long ago as 1983, but most recently in East Africa, where more than 6,000 people were injured in the attacks on our embassies in East Africa. That's a lot of people. And it is certainly the case that we know that terrorist groups are looking for chemical and biological agents. We have hard intelligence on that. That's not a fantasy. And the argument I would make is that the risk of getting it wrong once is dramatically greater in this field than it was when they were just using conventional weapons. No president of the United States can lightly consider the possibility that there will be 10,000 people killed of smallpox, for example, which is incidentally the weapon of choice if I were a terrorist. If you had 10,000 people killed if you had a smallpox released in the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, which is the third busiest airport in the United States, and it takes several days for smallpox to manifest itself, and incidentally, in most emergency rooms in the United States, it would be misdiagnosed. There's a fair chance that the people would be released untreated or given a couple of aspirins and sent home, and we do not have enough smallpox vaccine, even once we had figured out we were under attack. No president who can consider and accept that this could happen, lower probability but higher consequence, no president can afford not to take every measure he can to avoid it happening. That, to me, is the nexus. It is no longer a question that we have a fair margin of error. If we get it wrong, at most several hundred people will die. It's not pleasant to think of several hundred people dying, but it's not the end of the world. Well, tens of thousands of people dying begins to put a major stress even on a democracy as strong as ours is. So that's the first point. You cannot do a sort of straight line, look back at history and say it's okay. On your point about better analysis, I couldn't agree more. I don't have to say anything more. I completely agree. The better analysis you can get, the better. I think it's a very good point you make that non-hierarchical groups, if and when they get serious about turning to these kinds of agents, will have to develop some kind of hierarchy, as the Aum Shinrikyo did, and that may be an important intelligence indicator and warning to look for in these groups. It's a very good point. Now, I'll come back to your last question after I answer Hans. Where can we do better? But first let me clarify something, Hans. Our commission did not recommend any changes in any legal protections. The change that we recommended involved a internal CIA guideline, which is directed at the question about what kind of non-American terrorist informants they can hire. It has nothing to do with the protection of American rights. It has nothing to do with the American Constitution. It has nothing to do with the rights that citizens have in our democracy. It has to do with the question about, in effect, are you prepared to put somebody on the American government payroll who's not the kind of person you'd invite to a dinner in Wassenaar? And if you're not prepared to do that, then you're not going to have a serious counterterrorist intelligence.
But are you expecting other, say, European governments to do the same?
No. Every year, well, as a matter of fact, the major European governments involved in the fight in terrorism have no protections at all on this. They have much more latitude. We have by far the strictest. I can't speak to the Netherlands because I'm not familiar with what the Dutch intelligence rules may be, but I know what the rules are in, let's say, some other friendly European countries, and they basically have no rules. So our rules are by far the strictest. I'm not making any suggestions, prescriptions about what the Dutch should do. I'm just telling you what ours are. So I want to be very clear. We made no recommendation, but this was a bipartisan commission with Republicans and Democrats. Our recommendations were unanimous, which I was very pleased to have happen. And we had people on our commission who were, let's say, very friendly with groups like the American Civil Liberties Union, and the ACLU came and testified before our commission. I'm not saying that the ACLU would endorse our recommendations, but in fact, we made no recommendations that attacked any vital rights of Americans under our Constitution. We were very clear in the outset of that. Now, on the question of what we can do better, I think I outlined very briefly the two areas. One is, there probably is more, I'm sure there's more we can do on intelligence cooperation on bilateral basis among friendly countries, which is not just Europeans. We have, as was shown by the success we had in the Millennium attack, attempted Millennium attack in Jordan, we have extremely close relations, for example, in the intelligence field with Jordan. We have very good relations with intelligence agencies in other countries in that region. So it's not just the Europeans. With the Europeans, I think there is a fundamental issue we've got to get to the bottom of, which is to get some agreement about there is very little disagreement usually about how to deal with the terrorist groups themselves. The disagreement comes over the terrorist supporting states, Iraq and Iran, Libya to a lesser extent. On Iraq, I wish I believed that continuing the current embargo regime could be considered an effective way to keep Iraq from developing these kinds of weapons. I really don't think it has succeeded, and since we've had no inspections for 2 years, I don't think we can start by saying let's just continue. I don't think that's enough. And I think the new government, now I come to Marianne's question about the new government. I don't speak for any government now. One of the nice things about being
What are you saying, Jerry? Do you propose, in fact, to take smarter sanctions towards Iraq? Are there smarter sanctions?
I frankly am skeptical about the Secretary of State's comments on smarter sanctions. They have not yet elaborated what it means. I take it to mean that sanctions should be directed more at preventing military equipment and dual-use equipment from reaching Iraq, while you loosen up on the other sanctions so you can deal with the public relations problem of the starving kids. As you say, it isn't going to solve the starving kids problem, but that seems to be the theory. I don't understand how the present administration thinks it's going to be able to put an effective sanctions regime in narrowly defined like that. Where are the inspectors going to be? Who's going to do the inspection? Are we going to say to the Jordanians and the Turks that they have to do a better job policing their borders when in fact they have been complicit in violating the existing embargo? Are we going to put inspectors on the ground in Iraq? Where do we put them? What right do they have to open which things? I think this is an interesting idea that has got to be fleshed out a lot, and one has the uneasy feeling that it's a way to retreat from the sanctions regime entirely without saying you're doing it. So I'm a little skeptical about that.
No solution, as I hear.
No obvious one.
No obvious one. Quite. Should we involve the audience? I could imagine we've been talking quite a lot altogether. Are there any questions at this very point?
Yes, there are two microphones in the middle.
There are two
as
microphones here in the middle. Oh, yes, there's one over there as well. Could you mention your name, please?
Yeah, hi. I'm Jesse. I'm a Dutch American and also Jewish, so I know also some things about Israeli questions. Just to point out.
Yes, we're gathering information here. Thank you very much. Yes.
Everything to interpret it. I have a few comments, a few fundamental issues, because on the one hand, you are, and I think all of you are not making a clear distinction between the monopoly of state, which like Iraq has, but also the United States, or terrorists, which have, or monopoly of power, I'm sorry, which a state as Iraq has, and Iraq is a very border case in terrorist issues, I can see that, but the motives of many terrorists, as I know of, I've seen interviews with terrorists who did attacks in Israel, and their motives came mainly from, well, of course they had their inshallah, or I don't know how you call it, their
Intifada.
Yeah, well they said, well, we do it to go to heaven, but they did it because they were very poor, deprived people, and so fighting poverty will actually is also fighting terrorism. This is actually what I wanted to point out. And well, the United States, as you pointed out, Mr. Bremer, is you have an instrumentalist approach towards attacking terrorism. You can, if you know how to handle the knobs, then you are able to pinpoint what are exactly the problems, and then you can eliminate them. Whereas, and a guy like Osama bin Laden, of course, he's whatever, he might be a crazy man, but you will always have people with crazy ideas everywhere. The fact that he can have entire infrastructure and people working for him to do their suicide attacks is because of the privatization of these people, basically. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, bin Laden is not crazy. He's a very good example of what I talked about earlier. He's a very cold-blooded, rational man. Look, any discussion of terrorism usually comes to this question. It's a good question. It has to do with what is called the root causes of terrorism. How can you deal with terrorism the way you're describing without dealing with the reasons people become terrorists? And people become terrorists for a variety of reasons. And we said in our report, in fact, on the very first page of our report, we said there are a lot of reasons why people become terrorists. Sometimes for economic reasons, sometimes they feel politically repressed. Some of them are just plain criminals. But no reason excuses the killing of innocent civilians. Whatever the reason is, there is no excuse for killing innocent civilians. And I would make this point, that a counter-terrorist policy needs to do both things. A good foreign policy needs to do both things. It needs to address, where possible, the causes that people turn to terrorism, but you also need to address the effects. I make the comparison of the security in the streets in Amsterdam. You got plenty of crime in Amsterdam, we got plenty of crime in Washington. And people turn to that criminal action for different reasons. Some of them are drug addicts, some of them need the money, some of them haven't got a job, whatever the reason is. And you probably ought to deal with those things, but you don't then pull the police off the streets and say, well, we're going to deal with the root causes, but we're not going to worry about the crime. You have to do both. And it's the same in the fight against terrorism.
Yes, hi. My name is Elliot de la Valliere. I'm a Canadian living here in the Netherlands. My question also deals with what you just mentioned, with the fundamental cause of terrorism. Specifically, over the last 30 years, people or nations who were on the side of the motivation of the terrorist used a very offensive adage saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. In effect, they tried to decoy the slaughterers of innocent women and children as people who were coming up with a cause. As you just mentioned, there's no cause that justifies that. My question to you is, how do we deal with these people precisely who terrorists are trying to influence by teaching them and showing them that the moral equivalence between a terrorist as such and a freedom fighter is there's no comparison. In other words, freedom fighters or guerrillas usually attack armed individuals. Cowards and terrorists specifically, deliberately target innocent people.
Well, I think actually in this area, this is an area where there's actually been quite a lot of progress if you go back 30 years. I remember well this terrorism that started in the late 60s and 70s, and there was a lot of confusion, intellectual confusion, certainly in the United States about these terrorists. You have to remember that the terrorism came at a time of considerable unrest in America. We were in the middle of a very unpopular war. There were a lot of people in America who thought, well, these terrorists are against our government too, we're against the government, so they got sort of clouded. We were in the wake of a long anti-colonial period that started in the late 40s and 50s and 60s, and these people seemed to be sort of anti-colonial, and there were a lot of people in the United States, and I must say in Western Europe, who thought, well, they're anti-colonial and we're anti-colonial, and again, it got a little fuzzy. And there were people who liked to consider the terrorists then, and some even now, as latter-day Robin Hoods. You know, they rob from the rich and they give to the poor, and we're all sort of equal. I think, in fact, that a lot of those myths were blown away in the 1970s, late 70s, certainly in Europe with the domestic terrorism in Europe, homegrown terrorism in Europe, and in the United States with the takeover of our embassy in 1979. It's still a problem, but I think if you look back at it with a perspective of 30 years, it's a lot better now than it was. There's a lot less confusion.
May I just add one question? Speaking about the motives and tackling on the one hand, trying to remove the motives as such, and on the other hand, simply concluding that terrorism is in fact of all times and that you have to be alert and cautious and what have you. But simply to concentrate for 1 second on the motives, those motives have, I think, changed, Jerry, in the sense that can we say that what we see as terrorism today has mainly as motives either frustrated nationalism or religious fanatism, or often a combination of both, or are there more main motives that should be tackled?
No, I think if you look at where most of the incidents occur in the world, with the exception, and in my mind, and Marianne may have another one, of Colombia, I think your description captures probably 90% of the terrorism, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Peru or in the Middle East. It's either motivated by ideological, political, in some cases religious, or I would call it not national, more ethnic terrorism, ETA, IRA, the Tiger Tamils of Sri Lanka. I think if you put it in those baskets, you could probably capture 90%, with the exception of Colombia, which is a slightly different problem, where it's sort of a criminal operation.
Yeah, but that shows anyhow that as far as the motives are concerned, one knows what can be tackled politically and diplomatically, but also knows how difficult it is to find the right solutions there.
Right.
So we will have to live with the consequences of not being able of totally removing these root causes, and only step by step.
Right.
There was another question, I think. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jan Hertog. My question also has to do with motive, somewhat tangentially. You say that the United States is somewhat limited in its ability currently to recruit people on the inside, because the best information you could ever hope to have is from having a guy on the inside. What on earth would ever be the motive of somebody to get onto anybody's payroll and go on the inside? Be the guy who will get potentially be the first one to have the stuff tested on him if they find him out.
Well,
and how do you go about getting somebody, say for example in Afghanistan, who may be broadly sympathetic to the cause of bin Laden, but won't actually go out and shoot anybody, to actually turn against bin Laden and provide you with the information you want and need?
Well, in a subject I can't go into in too much detail in public, but in most cases you are probably trying to recruit somebody who's already a member of a group. You're not trying to insert him into the group. And he has, like all people, different desires and weaknesses, and those are the desires and weaknesses that any good intelligence agent is after in any potential recruitment, not excluding terrorists. And so there could be a variety of motives. Terrorist groups are clandestine, very hothouse kind of atmosphere where people get hatreds and dislikes of each other. There are people who have drug or drinking problems. There are people who need money. There are all the kinds of things that are common to any metropolitan police department, intelligence agents are also true in the real world, and those are the things you go after.
Somebody else.
My name is Hans Post. I've got a question along the lines of putting your money where your mouth is. And you're urging the Europeans to increase their efforts against terrorism. And an ultimate terrorist attack could be a major one in the United States. Now, how far would the United States be willing to legalize intelligence gathering efforts against its own citizens? And in that line, I might mention the word carnivore.
Yeah, you might explain what carnivore is.
Carnivore was a system that was, I think, devised by the police or the FBI.
FBI.
That could read email on a large scale.
Yahoo!
We looked very closely. We looked very closely. It was not a very well chosen name for a intelligence agency. Their public relations are a little. They could have at least called it vegetarian, I think. We looked very closely at the question of whether any substantial changes were required in the fight against the collection of intelligence against terrorists operating in the United States, and concluded that in fact there really were really no major changes needed. As I said, I maybe was too cryptic in my comments. The FBI, which is responsible for collecting terrorist intelligence in the United States, operates under a set of guidelines that were established by the Attorney General of the United States in 1983. Over the years, successive years of now 17 years, those guidelines have been periodically reviewed and revised by successive attorney generals and their legal staffs. And with due respect to the attorneys present, this has not led to the most clear definition of the guidelines. There have been basically too many lawyers been pecking away at this thing for 17 years. We looked at the guidelines. They run to about 45 pages, closely spaced pages, which are the guidelines that an FBI special agent in charge of a field office is supposed to know and understand and work from on whether he can or cannot begin to collect intelligence, whether he can open what is called a preliminary inquiry. We concluded, and had a lot of testimony from FBI agents serving in the field and retired, that the guidelines themselves, what's in the guidelines, is adequate. The FBI doesn't need anything more. What it needs is, it needs to be put in English. They need to take the lawyers out of the case and put people down who can write it down in English and send it out to the field. So that was really our only recommendation, and I think that'll happen. I don't think that's not a controversial recommendation. We did not see any areas, in fact, we stressed very clearly there are no areas in what we suggested that in any way infringe, as I said earlier to Hans, infringe on existing civil liberties that we take as the bedrock of America. We said on the very first page of our report, those civil liberties have to be the guiding tool of any public policy, including counterterrorist policy.
I think I'm looking. Where's Monique Knaper? Sorry.
Last question.
Last question. But before that last question, could we hear something, because I think that interests everybody who is interested in, let's say, the modern computer communications and what have you. Is there a severe risk as far as cyber terrorism is concerned, to name it in that somewhat difficult way? But one could think, of course, of the most disastrous consequences when using these modern techniques to sabotage or to destruct all kind of broad networks, with all the effects that may have on either electricity or hospitals or air traffic, or, well, you just name it. Maybe a few words on that would be interesting.
Okay, there is certainly a very broad risk of sabotage against modern communications. We looked at the question of whether we would call that terrorism or not, and concluded that it was a little hard for us to figure out where the terrorism part was. We could understand that if the United States or the Netherlands is at war with a country, you can expect in the modern day to have cyber war conducted.
name it. Maybe a few words on that would be interesting.
Okay, there is certainly a very broad risk of sabotage against modern communications. We looked at the question of whether we would call that terrorism or not and concluded that it was a little hard for us to figure out where the terrorism part was. We could understand that if the United States or the Netherlands is at war with a country, you can expect in the modern day to have cyber war conducted. Both sides will use electronic measures and countermeasures against each other to scramble communications, and it's already happened. It happened in Kosovo. And we could understand at the other end of the spectrum that there would be, as there have been, attacks to sabotage systems. Mostly it is done for extortion. Disgruntled employees in a company use it to extort money, or they steal credit card numbers. A bunch of Russians were indicted in San Francisco on Monday for stealing over 1 million credit cards off the internet. This kind of thing struck us as essentially criminal behavior, really not terrorism, because terrorism, at least in the American legal definition, is political violence against innocent civilians to affect a broader audience. Now, you could imagine scenarios where, in conjunction with, say, a conventional attack, a bomb attack, a terrorist group would then also penetrate the 911, which is the emergency response number in the United States, to make it harder for the fire department, the police department, the emergency medical services to respond to the bomb attack. But frankly, we did not go too deeply into this. I happen to be serving on another commission for my sins, looking at catastrophic terrorism in the United States and the federal government's, or if I can use the term loosely, organization to fight that terrorism. And we are spending this whole year looking at cyber terrorism. We'll have our report to the President in December on that. So there are vulnerabilities. The embassy here just held a very interesting conference, which I read a report on this evening on April 9th, looking at cybersecurity, not the terrorism, but cybersecurity. There are a lot of experts around. I'm sure the embassy would be happy to make that information available to anybody here. There are real vulnerabilities, and there are real problems in dealing with it, but whether it is really a terrorist problem and not a sabotage problem, I'm not sure. I don't know what you think.
I entirely agree with that, but what is true is that terrorists, like anybody else, are using computer communications, and that it's making their work more easy, and it's especially more easy to set up these all-channel networks by using computers and mobile telephones and what have you for quicker communication, and that makes them less difficult or less easy to catch.
Right. Well, we will refrain on making further suggestions to terrorists about this and go to the last question.
Too many hints.
My name is Steven van der Ven. Nice to see you, Mr. Bremer. How realistic is it if you look at Russia, who still, the country has so many nuclear devices guarded by military units who are poorly paid, that terrorist organizations may try to bribe a commander to buy a nuclear weapon, that kind of scenario. Could you please say something about that?
Well, there's been a lot of attention in the last decade to this problem of what we call loose nukes, and it's a serious problem. The Russians have got some 20,000 nuclear weapons drifting around. Not drifting around, there are 20,000 in their stockpile, some of which may be drifting around. For a terrorist, the nuclear weapon is really not the weapon of choice. It's by far the hardest weapon to manage physically. It's the hardest weapon to detonate. It's the hardest weapon to move around because there are detection systems in place that can detect radiological emanations. So I think the risk is greater that they sell one of these to a state rather than to a terrorist group, and that is a real problem. I'm particularly concerned by the fact that the Russians recently have, in fact, escalated their nuclear cooperation with Iran. Now, they say it's peaceful nuclear power, but we all know all of the experience we have in Iraq suggests that once you get started down that path, it's very easy to start diverting. The more serious problem, in a way, in Russia is not the hardware, it's the software. And what happens to those scientists? A Russian nuclear scientist today gets paid the equivalent of about $10,000 a year. That's not very much money. And there is, I think, a real risk that these people start leaking out and giving advice to particularly states, because, as I say again, for a terrorist group, the nuclear weapon, it may look appealing on the surface, but when you start considering the practicality, it's not very easy to do.
I agree.
Agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
Madam,
Yes, she's coming up.
Ambassador Cynthia Schneider, I thought that you were called upon for a final word. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Marianne.
Are we going to stay up here while she speaks? What are we doing?
Are we going down?
Well, better go downstairs.
We gotta go down. All right. I guess we're going down.
No, stay up there.
Stay
Don't
up
go
here.
down.
Okay,
Stay
we're
up
gonna
there. Stay up there. Please. Please,
stay
Tom,
here?
stay there. Yes.
Okay.
No, thank you very much, all three of you. I think, don't you, after hearing this discussion, it's not at all difficult to imagine how these two men together were able to persuade this country to do something which I understand nobody else except the two of them wanted to do. They are indeed very persuasive and very clear in their arguments. I can't talk about terrorism or counterterrorism in this country without thinking right away about Lockerbie and about the extraordinary role that this country, the Netherlands, has played in not preventing terrorism, but maybe in preventing future terrorist acts by courageously providing the venue and the means to hold the Lockerbie trial. As I look back, as I am now, on what has occurred in my time here as ambassador, I consider the role that the embassy played in taking care of and helping our American families who came here to attend the trial one of the embassy's proudest accomplishments. But I would like nothing more, as I think as a sentiment that would be shared by the host country for that trial, than for no other ambassador ever to have to greet families who have lost a family member to a terrorist act. So let's hope that there won't have to be more Lockerbie trials. I think the point was made very clearly tonight about the changing nature of terrorism, and we heard about the changing actors and their unpredictability in terrorism. I want to look just for a moment at the question of the changing technology of terrorism. And with reference to the cyber security issue, not terrorism, we will be posting, for those of you who are interested, the transcript of the cybersecurity conference that we held at the embassy, in The Hague, sponsored by the embassy and the RAND Corporation and Shell. We'll be posting that on our embassy webpage shortly. And in case there's anyone in the audience who hasn't memorized or doesn't already have it on your favorites, it is, of course, www.usemb.nl, if that interests you. But it's, I think, amazing to think of the changing technology of terrorism and the whole parameters of new terrorist experts. You think of one area that Ambassador Bremer talked about, biological terrorism. Well, the people who are the sort of sources of knowledge about this are very unlikely players in the field of terrorism. They're, of course, scientists, because this is the new frontier. This is, and those of you who know me will sort of groan, but it is a sort of aspect of biotechnology. It's biological terrorism. And it is indeed the scientists who can imagine how this could take place. And so it was, in fact, a geneticist who briefed former President Clinton and his cabinet and the Joint Chiefs of Staff about the potential, the horrendous potential of biological warfare a number of years ago, before former President Clinton gave his first address on that. Similarly, we'll have to look to the expertise of IT experts to truly understand cybercrime. So I couldn't agree more with the idea that you can't look at what has happened to imagine what might happen. Indeed, I remember one time turning on the radio and hearing former President Clinton saying a phrase, "Remember the past, imagine the future." And I thought, oh, how great that he's using that, because that happens to be a phrase that a group of us invented to to be the motto of the White House Millennium Program, which is a cultural celebration of America's creative accomplishments. And I thought, oh, great. Well, he wasn't talking about that at all. He was talking about terrorism. When you think about it, it is, I think, a very apt way to look at the problem. You remember what has happened in the past, but that's not enough. You have to really imagine the unimaginable to have a sense of what could happen in the future. Now, on that cheery note, I'm going to now make some announcements about future events for the John Adams Institute. On June 14th, Lori Moore, a novelist and short story writer, will be appearing to discuss her work in the Rhoda Hoot. And immediately thereafter, it's a very active organization as always, on June 19th, there will be a lecture and debate on a very hot topic here, migration and integration. And this will be done in cooperation with the University of Amsterdam with the speaker John Mellenkopf, the urban sociologist. The title will be Let's Ask New York, and it will be about differences in approaches between the US and the Netherlands to these problems. As those two programs happen to occur before and after my departure from this country, I want to take a couple of minutes just to say thank you for all you've done. Many times when I come here and see the great programs that the John Adams Institute puts on, I think, well, I'm sort of the deputy chief of mission and they're the real ambassador. So keep up the good work. Thank you.